I think I think it's one of the examples of where it starts, because those are things that are never available to the general public, right? Like the general public doesn't even know they exist, wouldn't have the money, wouldn't have the minimums, right? I mean, most private equity investments start at like 500,000 for a single share, right? So yeah, if you guys think this is illegal, far from it. Happens every single day. Very common practice. All right. So that's our client, right? So now we have a little bit of knowledge and we're ready to go into this meeting. So again, it's an exploratory conversation. We don't want to do any significant work for it. We're just talking, right? We're just talking to the client. So what are we going to talk about in an exploratory meeting? Well, we're going to, one of you is going to prepare a deck. I'm going to ask one of you to prepare a deck. And we're going to talk about ourselves. We're going to talk about the company history. We're going to present the executive bios, experience. We're going to talk about recent client projects without actually naming anybody, right? Because you still want to keep that confidentiality. We're going to listen to what the client has to say. Obviously they're calling us in because they might have their own ideas. But we're basically just there to listen. We're not really there to opine on anything. And we're also there to present the methodology that we intend to follow, right? And we can present a little bit about the project management methodology, but we're also there to present our approach to data science, right? And make sure that our approach to data science is fair and balanced and something that the client can get behind, right? So what is that methodology? So in the corner, you're going to find, my book for your first year in data science. I invite you to buy it on Amazon. It's basically intended to help people make that move into professional data science. So, you guys know that I don't sell any cheap courses. I don't beg you guys for money. I don't have a Patreon. So the best way to support me is buying my book. I appreciate your support. But this chart is straight out of that book. And this is the methodology that I advocate for. Because, again, you always want to make sure that you're being guided by a defensible methodology. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to go through a data collection process, right? That's where your data engineering tasks begin. We're going to go through a data enrichment process. What are some of the things that go into that can be added to your root data set? How can you enrich the data set? How can you transform the data set? Super important phase that a lot of teams forget. Then we're going to go into an EDA phase, right? Which also contains a visualization phase in there, right? And then we're going to do some ideation. All right, so we did our EDA, we got some visuals to look at. Where are we going with this? From there, we go into model design, right? We know we have a reliable pipeline. We know what our data looks like from an EDA and visualization perspective. Excuse me. We've sat with the client. We presented some potential ideas. They've signed off on those ideas. And now we're ready to work on a model. Right? What did the model tell us? Well, we got to interpret those results. And then you'll notice that there is an arrow here between the results and the model design. That's because there's a little bit of a loop there, right? Just because you have a model doesn't mean it's a good model. So maybe you have to go back a couple times. And you have to visualize different things, right? So there's a little bit of a loop there between interpreting the result and the model design. From there, this is kind of sort of an optional stage, but I find it beneficial to do another visualization step. And then we actually deploy the model. And then later, we can talk about model maintenance. I have another section on model maintenance in my book. But generally speaking, this is going to be the showcase when we go and talk to a client about how we want to develop, how we're going to develop their project. Right? So this is what you're seeing now is the core of what we want to present and say, hey, this is us. These are our executives. This is who we work for. This is some of our example projects. This is the methodology that we feel gets us and you to a solution. And, that's what we'd like to do for you. What do you think? So that, to me, makes for an effective exploratory meeting, again, without doing any significant work for them, because we don't have a contract in place, right? We haven't really created an engagement with the client. We don't have their data, right? But this is what I have seen and I have used, I have received, right? Because I have been both on the giving end and the receiving end of these types of exploratory meetings, right? Does anybody have any questions on the methodology? Because there's a lot happening in this chart, right? But super critical, guys. Super critical. Because this is the stuff that nobody out there is showing, right? They'll tell you, oh, you got to start with Python right away. Well, how can you start with Python if you haven't had the data? If you haven't enriched the data? So many teams go wrong in the data enrichment side. And then how can you go straight to Python in modeling if you haven't had a conversation about the ideation with your client? Right? Like it just doesn't make sense. That's not how you do it in a professional setting. So what do you guys think? There's a lot happening on this chart. Any questions, any feedback? Would love to hear from you guys. So Zeneb is asking, is feature engineering a sort of data enrichment? Yes, absolutely. 100%. I name it data enrichment because it has so many names, right? People call it feature engineering, data wrangling, data transforms, but it's all the same thing, right? You're just trying to not work from the same data set that your client gives you, right? I see this mistake constantly where people say, oh, we got the client data. There's 30 columns. That means we have 30 features to work from. No, that's just the base set, right? Once you do your transforms and your enrichment, you might have less. But typically speaking, you should have more than that, right? I mean, I know it's all data dependent and all that. But if you're just saying, here's 30 columns from the client, here's my 30 columns that I'm doing features on, that is terrible, terrible data science, right? Because you completely have missed that enrichment and the feature engineering and all that. So yeah, it's all this. It's all the same term in there, Zeneb. I just call it data enrichment across the board. Good question. Good question. Anybody else? There's a lot happening on this chart. But again, this is going to be our guiding light towards everything that we want to do. So Leo says, when it comes to data collection, pipelines, etc., what are the technical tools relevant to master? SQL maybe? SQL doesn't hurt, Leo, for sure. It's helpful. But remember, and this is another thing that, again, not a lot of schools teach. And I wrote this in my book, right? Data in the real world, particularly on the collection side, tends to be very messy.